Today we're going to be looking at the transatlantic slave trade that existed between Africa, Europe, and the New World, the Americas. First thing you need to know is that slavery's been around as soon as one guy realized that he could use force to exert his will over someone else. That's how old slavery is. Probably goes back to the caveman days. It's existed from the beginning of time. Could have been from people being captured in war, people being in debt, needing to survive, selling their labor basically to other people in order to exist. As people evolved and as human history evolved, what ends up happening is that people start selling their conquered to their enemies or to other folks in order to get money or get favor with another group of people. The difference, however, between the way slavery had become industrialized in the 17th and 18th century and to ancient slavery is that your children usually weren't slaves and that you were more of an indentured servant. You could earn your freedom or purchase your freedom over a period of time or eventually become adopted by the group of people that had enslaved you. So that's how they differed. Now, the Atlantic slave trade started really in the 1500s when European explorers started to go to the African coast to explore and to basically get natural resources, one of which they were getting was people. They needed people to basically work the plantations that they had found in other parts of the world. They needed people that were used to working in a tropical environment. You had other kingdoms that were offering their enemies or people they captured in war as slaves. The Europeans were happy enough to take them, and they did. There was also an element of racism to it. From the European perspective, Africans were looked upon as inferior peoples. And as I stated earlier, the slaves were treated not like indentured servants, but as property, as possessions, as beasts of burden. And that's how they were treated. Slaves typically were bought from other Africans, caught during raids, and in many cases tricked into slavery. And we'll see some examples of this in another class period. Slaves were typically branded. Sometimes this could be done by people who captured them or people to whom they were sold. People were branded much like cattle is branded today. This should give us some indication as to how human beings viewed other people as human beings, or not as human beings. Now, from the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, as I had said earlier, slavery is not something that was invented in the 1500s. It existed in every culture at some point in time. Africa was no different. Slavery existed for thousands of years. As I had stated, though, the slavery that had existed in many cultures was different from how it became globalized in the 1500s to the 1800s, where slaves were treated as property, not as servants, as they had been previously. You were sold to us as a slave. You were sold into a life of slavery. Your children would be slaves, and their children would be slaves, and that's how it was going to be. And there was also an element of divide and conquer to the slavery. You can see in the picture on the left-hand side a man holding a gun, dressed in European-style clothing, leading other people as slaves. Europeans would choose one group, they would dominate over the others, and sell other people into slavery. And many times among Africans, even seeing each other as superior and inferior races. Slaves, when they were sold into slavery, had to be checked to make sure they would be a quality slave. There was an inspection period to see if you were going to survive the trip across the Atlantic, if you were going to be a good worker, if you were healthy. Usually men were valued, then women and children were next. The process was pretty simple. You would be captured or sold by a tribe to European traders. From that point, you'd be shackled, thrown into the bow of a ship, maybe transported to a larger ship, and then you'd make the voyage across the Atlantic, either going to South America, Central America, the Caribbean, or North America. You'd be put on auction for different plantation owners to purchase. Families were separated. It did not matter. And you would spend the rest of your life on a plantation until you would be quite literally worked to death. Sometimes slaves were literally breeded to other slaves to ensure a better production of worker. And this happened for hundreds of years. It was not something that was uncommon, especially in South America and Central America. Cause of the slave trade primarily was the explosion of plantation farming in the New World. You had these massive plantations, whether it was sugarcane, tobacco, or coffee, whatever the good may have been. It was very labor intensive. And originally Native Americans were used as laborers, but as they started to die off from disease or overwork, more laborers were needed to be brought in to work on these plantations. Quite naturally, the plantation owners did not want to have to pay workers to do it, so they brought in workers as slaves from other parts of the world. These workers that they brought in were from areas that could survive in tropical climates and may even be familiar with some of the things that were being grown. In Africa, you had African kingdoms offering people as slaves in exchange for guns, rum, other goods, for power, for prestige, for power over an enemy. For various reasons, you had Africans being sold into slavery and taken over to the New World. Here we see a diagram of a slave ship. Now this is a pretty big one. Slaves would be put on different levels. They would pack as many into a ship as was humanly possible. Sometimes as wasn't possible, it was overflowing because not all of the people were going to survive the trip across the Atlantic. The number of people that started the journey versus the number of people that finished the journey could be vastly different in many circumstances. That could be from disease, it could be from illness, or it could just simply be that the slave ship was going to get caught doing something that they weren't supposed to do, so they quite literally dumped their human cargo overboard. As I said, slaves were packed in like sardines, as many as they could pack into a boat, because not all of them were going to survive the trip. This is an example of slaves in the coffin position. Again, where you would stay on the slave ship, you didn't have much room to move around. People were on top of people. There wasn't really anywhere that you could go to the bathroom. If you were sick, it was not the type of place that was hospitable to human beings. Nevertheless, human beings were put in this situation. It is estimated, and the numbers vary, but generally speaking, researchers have put the number around 8 million Africans died during this transatlantic slave voyage. In transport, between 15 and 20% of all slaves died. Like I said, that could be from illness, that could be from malnutrition, shock, any number of things would cause a slave to die on the way over. A lot of those people who became sick and weak were thrown overboard. There's a very good depiction of this in the movie Amistad. They show the human cargo being thrown overboard. People that were seen as people that weren't going to survive the trip. They weren't worth the food that they were being fed. They needed it to feed other people that were healthier, so they would be cast overboard. This is a pretty good diagram that shows how the transatlantic slave trade worked. You had Europeans bringing guns, rum, and other finished products to Africa to be traded or bought in exchange for slaves. These slaves would be taken over to the New World, where they would work on plantations to produce these goods that would be shipped back to Europe to be sold, and in some cases be sold in Africa. So it was a very vicious cycle that was happening here. And you had, basically it was in the shape of a triangle. It's been described as the triangular slave trade many times. And this is the Middle Passage, which had to be survived by people crossing Africa, from Africa to the New World. Most slaves went to Central and South America. 5% of all slaves went to North America. As you can see here, the numbers kind of point out to where most slaves went. Vast majority went to what was the Spanish Empire, or Brazil, which was part of Portuguese. It was a Portuguese colony. Again, though, where most of the plantations were, that's where most of the slaves went. Cuba, for example, Jamaica, Brazil, a lot of these areas. The first slave auction in North America can be dated back to the 18th century, the 17th century in New Amsterdam, New York City. You can see the date up here, 1643. Slavery was not uncommon in the United States, and it was very common in the South. Existed probably for a little more than 200, or definitely more than 200 years in North America and the United States. North America, of course, didn't exist yet. Here we see a slave auction in the South, an artist's depiction of it. A family is going to be separated, people being treated like property. Now, you did have abolitionist movements, and in many cases, even before the foundation of the United States, you had large groups of people that were opposed to the slave trade, especially Quakers and other religious groups. It was not uncommon to treat slaves much like animals. You can see this man here being muzzled, shackled. It was very inhumane. Lynchings were not uncommon, especially if there was a slave uprising or if a slave was caught doing something or was accused of doing something they weren't supposed to be doing. Lynching was a practice where it was not a legal thing, but the people of the area would basically, the mob would kill a slave to appease the mob. It was not uncommon to hang people, specifically by the waist. They would dangle and writhe there for a long time. It was a very slow death, but it was meant to instill fear in others, and that was a part of lynching as well, to instill fear in the slave population. 10 to 15 million Africans were displaced by the slave trade, and that's just a rough estimate. These numbers really weren't well kept. However, you did have a lot of culture moving from one place to another, African food, music, religion. But the most productive members of African society were gone. They had been taken out of their homeland and moved to other parts of the world, and this had a very negative effect on the development of Africa and many of the cultures in Africa. And the tribes eventually were so weakened by this that they became dominated by the European nations. Finally, slavery did end in the United States in 1865, but it ended in a lot of other areas, specifically Great Britain, a lot earlier than that. The United States then started to make efforts to halt the slave trade, and to agree they were successful at this after the Civil War, but it did take a Civil War to officially stop slavery in the United States. Quakers played a big role in the abolitionist movement. People like Frederick Douglass, that were former slaves in the United States, became big-time abolitionists in the United States, and they still are very memorable folks in American history today. King Afonso in Africa had to do his part as well. He ended the slave trade in his kingdom, enforced it by penalty of death. If anyone was caught engaging in the slave trade, he would put them to death. So you had to have a number of people on both sides of the Atlantic deciding that this was going to stop. And eventually you did that, but it was not until you had millions of people die as a result.